My name is Leland Watkins, and the day my daughter's fiancé looked me in the eye and said, "Beggars like you have no place at our wedding," something inside me shattered. What cut even deeper was seeing my own daughter nod in silence, agreeing with the man who saw me as nothing but a disgrace. They thought I was just an old fool in worn khakis, unworthy of standing beside them. But what they didn't know was that hidden beneath the life they mocked lay a truth worth millions. And when the time came, the truth would destroy everything they thought they had built. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching from and how old are you? Please subscribe to Family Betrayal Unmasked to hear more powerful stories like this one. Beggars have no place at our wedding. Those words slammed into me like a hammer to the chest. I was sitting across from Victor, the man who claimed to love my daughter, in an upscale Manhattan restaurant where chandeliers sparkled like frozen stars. His voice carried through the oak-paneled room, sharp enough that every nearby diner turned their head. My hands trembled against the white tablecloth, but I forced them still. I wanted to believe I had misheard him, that his arrogance was a slip of the tongue. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw no mistake, only contempt. What cut me deeper than Victor's insult was Loretta's silence. My daughter, the little girl I once carried on my shoulders through crowded carnivals, sat beside him in her designer dress, twisting the diamond ring on her finger. She couldn't even meet my eyes. I waited for her to defend me, to say something, anything that would remind me she still remembered who I was. Instead, she shifted uncomfortably, her gaze fixed on her wine glass. Finally, in a voice so soft it nearly broke me, she said, "Maybe Victor has a point." A point. As though my presence, my very being, was nothing more than an inconvenience at her wedding. 30 years of sacrifice. The nights I worked, double shifts so she could have new school clothes. The weekends I gave up so she could join soccer teams. The bills I paid without complaint, all erased with one careless sentence. Victor leaned back in his chair, his $3,000 suit catching the glow of the chandelier, his gold watch flashing as he draped an arm around Loretta's shoulders. "This will be an elite event," he said smugly. "We can't have you ruining the atmosphere." His words weren't whispered. They were a performance. The other diners watched like theater-goers sipping expensive wine while my humiliation became their evening's entertainment. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sand. My wife Mary had passed years ago, but her voice echoed in my memory. "Family stands together, sweetheart. Money comes and goes, but family is forever." That had been our creed, the foundation of everything we built. Yet here I was, discarded like an embarrassing relic, because I didn't fit Victor's image. I folded my napkin carefully and set it beside my untouched plate. My body moved mechanically, but inside me something was tearing apart. "I understand," I said evenly, though my chest felt like it might cave in. Loretta's fingers fidgeted nervously, but she didn't speak again. Victor smirked, snapping his fingers at a passing waiter to order another bottle of champagne. "See how easy that was," he crowed. As I rose and walked toward the exit, I felt every pair of eyes following me. The doorman held the glass door open, his face expressionless, but I saw pity in his eyes. Outside, the spring air hit my face, but it did nothing to cool the fire of shame burning inside me. They thought I was broken, defeated, dismissed as nothing but a beggar. But as I stood on that sidewalk, a realization began to stir, a cold, clear thought. If Loretta valued money above blood, then perhaps it was time she learned just how much money I truly had. My own daughter couldn't meet my eyes. That truth gnawed at me as I stood on the curb outside the restaurant, fumbling with my truck keys. Loretta, once the little girl who used to run into my arms after school, who called me her hero, had lowered her gaze, ashamed to claim me as her father. The humiliation of Victor's insult was sharp, but Loretta's quiet agreement cut far deeper. I climbed into my old pickup, the seat springs creaking beneath me. Through the large front windows of the restaurant, I saw them return to their meal, laughing, now relieved that the unpleasant distraction of me was over. Loretta lifted her glass, her face animated as she spoke to Victor. Her smile was polished, perfect for the image he demanded. I sat frozen, staring through the glass like an outsider watching someone else's life. The engine coughed to life, its familiar rumble, a reminder of simpler years. I merged into traffic, Manhattan's glittering skyline looming ahead, every gleaming tower mocking me. I had spent decades in the shadow of those buildings, working honest shifts, saving every spare dime, raising Loretta to believe love mattered more than money. And now, in the heart of that same city, I had been told I was too poor, too common to even witness her marriage. My hands shook on the steering wheel, the memory of Mary's voice echoing in my ears. Family stands together. Mary had believed that with all her heart. I thought I had raised Loretta to believe it too. But somewhere along the way, I had lost her. Was it my modest house, my second-hand clothes, my refusal to chase wealth the way others did? I had always thought my love was enough. At a rest stop, I pulled over and opened my wallet. Inside was a creased photograph I carried everywhere, Mary, Loretta, and me at her college graduation. Mary's arm was wrapped around our daughter, both women smiling as if the world belonged to them. My chest ached as I traced their faces with my thumb. "Mary, where did I lose her?" I whispered. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, and the smell of gasoline filled the air. But all I could see was the image of a family that no longer existed. I remembered Loretta at 8 years old coming home from school in tears because classmates mocked our old car. I'd worked 3 extra shifts that month, determined she'd never feel ashamed again. And Mary, patient-wise, Mary kneeling beside her bed, telling her that love and family outweighed material things. Loretta had once believed that. She had defended me back then. Now she sided with a man who dismissed me as trash. The realization struck like ice in my veins. Loretta hadn't just changed overnight. She had been drifting away for years, shorter visits on holidays, distracted conversations, excuses about important people to see in the city. I had brushed it off as adulthood independence. But tonight revealed the truth. She wasn't drifting. She was running from me, from everything I represented. For the first time in my life, sorrow hardened into something else. As I sat in the truck under the humming lights, I felt the ache inside me shift. Shame gave way to clarity. Victor had measured me by my clothes and my car. Loretta had judged me by the image I failed to project. If appearances and money were their gods, then perhaps it was time I showed them what real wealth looked like. See how easy that was. Victor's words still rang in my head, mocking me long after I'd left the restaurant. He had humiliated me in front of strangers, and my daughter had laughed nervously beside him, as though it were nothing more than a mild social hiccup. That moment replayed again and again, as I drove north, headlights from sleek Mercedes and BMWs flashing past my weathered pickup. To them, I was just another invisible old man clinging to a relic of a truck. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles whitening as I remembered the looks from the other diners. They hadn't tried to hide their curiosity, turning their heads, whispering behind expensive glasses of wine, reveling in the theater of a father cast aside like an uninvited guest. My humiliation had been their evening's entertainment. Victor had orchestrated it perfectly, the expensive restaurant, the champagne, the audience. He wanted me to feel small, and in that moment he succeeded. But humiliation can do strange things to a man. It can break him, or it can forge something new. Sitting there in traffic, I felt the first spark of something I hadn't known in years, a cold, sharp clarity cutting through the fog of shame. When I finally reached my small home in Connecticut, the quiet was deafening. Family photos lined the mantel, Loretta's childhood birthdays, her soccer trophies, Mary's smile lighting up every frame. I sank into my worn armchair, staring at those pictures as the weight of the night pressed down on me. For years I had been content to live modestly, quietly, even invisibly. But now invisibility had been turned against me, twisted into proof of unworthiness. I thought back to Victor snapping his fingers at the waiter, the way Loretta's face had lit up when he commanded with such arrogance. She had once admired my humility, but now she seemed enthralled by his display of dominance. It wasn't just about money, it was about image, the illusion of power. I rose from the chair and wandered into the kitchen, the old linoleum floor creaking under my feet. I poured a cup of coffee, though my hands shook too badly to drink it. I could still hear Loretta's voice, soft and apologetic. Maybe Victor has a point. That single sentence had done more damage than Victor's entire performance. She wasn't just tolerating his cruelty, she was endorsing it. The shame twisted into something sharper, betrayal. And betrayal, I realized, was fuel. Out in the garage, my old tools sat neatly on their pegboard, a reminder of the countless hours I'd spent repairing what others would have thrown away. Fixing things had always been my way of fighting back against the world's harshness. But tonight, as I stood there staring at the rows of hammers and wrenches, I understood this was not something I could fix with steel and sweat. This required something else, something Victor and Loretta valued above all else: money. I felt a strange calm settle over me as the idea crystallized. If they measured worth by wealth, then perhaps it was time to show them just how wrong they were. Not by pleading for acceptance, not by begging for a seat at their table, but by turning the very currency they worshipped into the blade that cut their illusions apart. Mary, where did I lose her? I whispered into the empty living room, my voice swallowed by the silence. The framed photos stared back at me. Mary's radiant smile on our wedding day, Loretta in pigtails, clutching her first soccer trophy, family moments frozen in time before wealth and appearances became the measure of love. The house felt smaller that night, like the walls themselves had drawn closer to remind me of all that I had sacrificed. I closed my eyes and let myself drift back to a Christmas years ago. Loretta had been barely 10, and money was tight. I'd worked every extra shift I could manage, coming home late with hands cracked from overtime. That year, all I could afford was a simple dollhouse kit I'd built in the garage. I had worried it wouldn't be enough. But when she unwrapped it, her eyes lit up brighter than any Christmas tree. "Daddy, you made this?" "It's perfect," she cried, throwing her arms around my neck. Back then, she understood the value of love poured into sacrifice. Now she couldn't even bear for me to sit in a pew at her wedding. The memory cut deep, sharper than Victor's words. He was just a man puffed up with borrowed power. But Loretta, she was my blood, my reason for pushing through every hardship. Her betrayal pierced in ways no stranger's insult ever could. I walked into the basement, each creaking step echoing like a countdown. The air was cool and smelled faintly of sawdust. My workbench was cluttered with unfinished projects, little things I had meant to fix, but what drew me forward was the old safe tucked under a heavy tarp. My hand rested on the cold steel, and for a moment I hesitated. Mary's birthday, then Loretta's, that was the combination. My fingers spun the dial from muscle memory, and with a final click, the heavy door opened. Inside, neatly organized in manila folders, lay the truth. Stock certificates, investment statements, years of quiet decisions that no one, not even Loretta, knew about. My colleagues had laughed when I put my savings into Apple back in 1995. They mocked me again in 2003 when I bet on Tesla. But tonight, as I flipped through the folders, the numbers spoke louder than any insult Victor could ever hurl. Apple worth 12 million, Tesla 4 million, other small investments bringing the total to 17 million. And yet Loretta and Victor had called me a beggar. Tucked inside was another folder, one I hadn't opened in weeks. Draft documents for a trust fund $10 million I had planned to announce as her wedding gift. I had pictured her face lighting up the way it did with that dollhouse years ago. But now the thought of handing that fortune to a daughter who had dismissed me made my stomach churn. For the first time that night, I felt something other than grief. Purpose. Loretta had chosen Victor's illusion of wealth over her father's love. If she valued money so highly, then money would be the very thing that exposed her mistake. I shut the safe with a metallic thud. In that sound, I heard the closing of one life and the beginning of another. If she values money, then money will be my answer. That thought followed me upstairs like a shadow. I brewed another pot of coffee, though it was nearly dawn, the bitter smell filling the kitchen. The chipped mug in my hands felt familiar grounding, but my mind was already somewhere else, plotting, shaping, hardening. I sat at the small table where Mary and I had once shared late-night talks. She had always been the calm voice of reason, reminding me not to let pride guide my choices. But what had happened at that restaurant wasn't just about pride. It was about dignity. Victor hadn't simply mocked my clothes. He had mocked the very life I had built, the years of sacrifice that put food on Loretta's plate and shoes on her feet. And worse, my daughter had let him. The truth settled over me like armor. They thought they had stripped me of value, but I had something they could never imagine. I walked back to the living room, staring at the mantle of photographs again. Every picture told a story: Loretta's first steps, her prom night, her graduation day. Each frame was proof of the man I had been, a father who gave everything. And now those same sacrifices were dismissed as irrelevant because they weren't wrapped in silk or parked in marble driveways. I opened my notebook, a habit I'd kept for years. Its pages held grocery lists, repair notes, and quiet reflections. That night, I began a different kind of entry. I wrote one sentence at the top: if they worship money, let money become the lesson. The words looked back at me steady and sharp. The plan wasn't clear yet, but the foundation was forming. I would not argue with Loretta or try to convince her of my worth with pleading words. Words had failed. Instead, I would let actions speak louder than Victor's champagne toasts, louder than Loretta's silence. I would use the very thing they had chosen over me to dismantle their illusions. By the time the first light of morning slipped through the curtains, I felt a strange calm. No more tears, no more questions. The humiliation of last night had burned away the remnants of doubt. All that remained was resolve. I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway. The man staring back looked tired lines etched deeper by the night's pain. But in his eyes was something new, steel. For years I had been content to live small, unnoticed, believing my daughter's love was unshakable. Now I understood that invisibility had been mistaken for weakness. I placed Mary's photograph on the kitchen table and spoke aloud, as if she were still there. They need to learn Mary. Not for revenge alone, but because if they can humiliate me so easily, they'll never understand what matters. They'll pass that poison on. The clock ticked quietly, marking the end of one chapter in my life. Victor thought he had silenced me with a public insult. Loretta thought she had erased me with her silence. But they had only awakened something stronger. The beggar they dismissed no longer existed. In his place stood a man preparing to show them exactly what real wealth looked like. The safe clicked open with a sound like destiny. That's the only way I can describe it. I stood in the basement, the early morning sun slipping through narrow windows, dust floating in the air like tiny witnesses. My fingers had spun the dial out of muscle memory, Mary's birthday, then Loretta's, and now the heavy steel door creaked wide, revealing the secret I had guarded for decades. Inside were manila folders, neat and ordinary at first glance. But each one held the story of a lifetime risks, taken ridicule endured, and quiet victories never spoken aloud. I pulled the first folder free. On the top lay a certificate dated 1995, Apple Computer 1,000 shares at $50 each. My entire life savings back then poured into a company people thought was finished. My coworkers had laughed, shaking their heads, telling me I had thrown away a future on toys for hobbyists. They told me I should have bought a new car instead. I turned the paper in my hands, running my thumb across the embossed lettering. That foolish gamble had grown into $12 million. I set it aside and reached for the next folder. Tesla, 2003, another $50,000 invested when most people barely knew the name. Colleagues had called it insanity betting on electric cars when gas stations ruled the country. Now those shares were worth $4 million. I stacked the folders on the workbench, each one whispering the same truth. While others mocked my choices, I had built something enduring, something real. $17 million in total sitting quietly in this safe, while Victor looked me in the eye and called me a beggar. My hand shook slightly as I pulled out the last folder. This one was different. It wasn't filled with stock certificates or bank statements. It was a draft prepared by my attorney, a trust fund for Loretta. $10 million set aside, designed to provide her stability for life, while encouraging generosity through education and charity clauses. I had planned to unveil it at her wedding, my speech ending with the gift of security that would outlive me. But now, staring at the neat rows of legal language, my chest burned with a different fire. That trust had been written for a daughter who valued family above money, who would see it as an extension of her father's love. The daughter I had sat across from in that restaurant no longer existed. I placed the folder back into the safe, my hand firm. The decision was sudden but absolute. That money would never reach Loretta's hands. Not while she chose arrogance over loyalty, image over love. As I spun the dial shut and heard the lock click, I felt something shift inside me. This was no longer about humiliation. This was about teaching a lesson Victor and Loretta could never forget. They wanted to measure me by wealth. Then I would use that very yardstick to show them just how blind they had been. $10 million meant for her. The thought weighed on me as I sat at the kitchen table, the draft trust papers spread out in front of me. I traced the embossed letterhead with a fingertip, imagining the scene I had once pictured Loretta in her wedding dress, tears of joy streaming down her face as I announced her gift before the guests. It was supposed to be the moment that secured her future and honored Mary's memory. But the woman who had sat across from me in that restaurant wasn't the same daughter I raised. She hadn't defended me. She hadn't hesitated. She had sided with him. I picked up the phone, my thumb hesitating only a second before dialing James Thompson, my financial broker and friend for more than 15 years. The line rang twice before his familiar voice answered, calm but curious. "Leland, you never call during market hours? What's going on?" I inhaled slowly. "We need to make some changes, James. Big ones." There was silence on the other end, then the sound of him leaning back in his chair. "Changes, Leland. Your portfolio is rock solid. Are you sure you want to stir things up?" "I'm sure," I said firmly. "The trust fund we structured for Loretta, it needs to be dissolved. Every last clause." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I thought this was about providing her long-term security. What happened? I stared at the photographs lined up along the mantel across the room. Circumstances have changed, I said evenly. I need the assets redirected. Draft new documents, not to Loretta, to educational charities, scholarships, something that will actually matter. James exhaled slowly. I'll need to get the attorneys involved. Are you certain once this is filed, it's binding? I've never been more certain of anything I said, and to my surprise, a calmness washed over me. Yesterday, I had been broken by humiliation. Today, I was in control. As we talked logistics, my eyes caught Mary's photograph resting beside the phone. Her smile seemed to steady me. She had always believed in the power of teaching lessons through actions, not lectures. And this would be the lesson of a lifetime for Loretta, for Victor, and for everyone who judged worth by appearances. When I finally hung up, the room felt different. Quieter, sharper, as though every corner had been stripped of doubt. The decision was made. I gathered the papers and slid them back into the safe, locking it with a decisive spin. For years, I had been invisible, my modest truck and old jacket convincing the world that I was a nobody. But invisibility had its advantages. No one had seen me coming. No one suspected the weight of what I carried. Victor thought he had humiliated me. Loretta thought she had erased me. But they had only set the stage for their own undoing. I closed my eyes and whispered into the stillness, "Mary, you were right. Family stands together. But if they turn away, then family must also face the truth." Hello, James. We need to rewrite everything. Those words echoed in my mind long after I ended the call with my broker. It felt as if I had closed a door that could never be reopened. The trust was gone. The future I had quietly secured for Loretta was erased with a single decision. But in its place, something else was forming, an idea sharper than grief, stronger than humiliation. If Victor believed money was the ultimate power, then I would use money in a way he could never anticipate. I would show him that wealth wasn't about champagne bottles and expensive suits. It was about what you could make the world believe. And when the curtain rose on his so-called elite wedding, I would step onto that stage with a performance that would strip him bare. The first step was image. For decades, I had lived simply content in my modest house, my old truck, and second-hand clothes. But invisibility had been twisted into evidence of poverty. Very well. I would craft a new image, not for myself, but for the lesson they both needed to learn. I still remember walking into that Rolls-Royce dealership on Fifth Avenue. I wore the same khakis and worn jacket that Victor sneered at, deliberately choosing to look like the man he thought I was. The showroom sparkled like a cathedral of excess marble floors shining under crystal chandeliers. Salesmen drifted between gleaming machines that cost more than most homes, their eyes darting toward wallets before they even said hello. One young salesman approached me reluctantly, his smile thin and insincere. "Are you sure you're in the right place, sir?" His voice was polite enough, but the condescension dripped like oil. I let him lead me to the centerpiece of the showroom, a midnight blue Phantom, its chrome gleaming under the lights. He chuckled when I asked about the price, over $500,000. "Perhaps I can show you something more suitable to your budget," he said. I reached into my leather portfolio and placed a certified check on the counter, $500,000 signed and ready. His smirk vanished, replaced by wide-eyed shock. Within minutes, managers and staff swarmed around me, tripping over their apologies, eager to demonstrate features, to bow and scrape in the presence of someone they now recognized as a serious buyer. It was intoxicating, not because I craved their respect, but because I had seen the flip of the switch, the way judgment melted into reverence the moment money was revealed. That was the same lesson Victor was about to learn, only magnified 100-fold. By the end of the afternoon, I had purchased the Phantom outright. Midnight blue exterior, cream leather interior, every luxury package included. More importantly, I secured a driver, Marcus Thompson, a former military man with impeccable credentials. He shook my hand firmly and said, "It would be an honor to serve you, Mr. Watkins." His professionalism was exactly what I needed. Driving home that evening, watching the Phantom glide into my modest driveway, I couldn't help but smile. Victor thought he had stripped me of dignity. But soon I would arrive at his wedding with a car that whispered power, a driver who radiated respect, and a presence no one could ignore. The beggar he had mocked was gone. In his place, I was becoming something else entirely, someone Victor could never have imagined. If Victor thinks money is power, I muttered to myself as I buttoned my old jacket in the mirror, staring at the worn fabric stretched across my shoulders. For decades, this had been enough, a serviceable uniform for a man who valued work and humility over flash. But the world Victor lived in didn't recognize humility. It only respected appearances. If I was going to confront him on his chosen battlefield, then I would need to play by his rules. 2 days after I bought the Phantom, I stepped onto Madison Avenue and pushed open the tall glass doors of Brooks Brothers. The showroom gleamed under soft, golden lights. Mannequins draped in Italian wool standing like sentinels of wealth. My heart beat faster as I crossed the polished floors, aware that my scuffed shoes and fraying jacket marked me as out of place. A young consultant approached, his smile professional but curious. "Good afternoon, sir. How may I help you today?" I straightened my shoulders. "I need a complete transformation," I said simply. "Custom tailoring, accessories, everything." For a moment he blinked at me, perhaps expecting me to laugh and admit I was joking. But when I pulled out my portfolio and showed him I was serious, his expression shifted to eager attentiveness. In a matter of minutes, I was being measured from neck to ankle, the tape sliding across shoulders and waist, while bolts of fine cloth were brought forward for inspection. We chose a charcoal gray Italian wool so smooth it felt like silk beneath my fingers. The consultant explained thread counts and fabric weights as though he were reciting poetry. "Classic cut, impeccable construction," he said, holding the fabric up to my frame. "This suit will make you command respect the moment you walk into a room." From there we moved to shirts, Egyptian cotton in crisp whites and subtle blues, followed by silk ties threaded with deep burgundy. I slipped on a pair of Italian leather shoes, each step cushioned by craftsmanship no factory could replicate. Finally, he laid out a Rolex, date just its gold and steel gleaming under the lights. I fastened it to my wrist and felt the weight immediately heavier than any watch I'd ever worn, but symbolic, like strapping on armor. When I looked into the mirror during the first fitting, I barely recognized myself. Gone was the retiree in khakis and scuffed boots. The man staring back carried himself differently, his shoulders squared, his gaze steady, his posture radiating quiet command. Even in unfinished form, the transformation was undeniable. As I wrote the check, I realized this was more than clothing. This was strategy. Victor had dismissed me as a beggar because he couldn't see past my modest exterior. Fine. At his wedding, he and everyone else would see me in a new light. They would see what true wealth looked like when paired with dignity. The consultant promised final adjustments by June 12th with a fitting on the 13th. "You'll be perfectly prepared for your event," he assured me. I nodded, folding the receipt carefully into my pocket. Walking back into the bustle of Madison Avenue, I caught my reflection in a shop window. Even in my old jacket, something fundamental had shifted. I no longer walked like a man who had been humiliated. I walked like a man planning a reckoning. Even the salesman bowed. That thought lingered with me long after I left Madison Avenue, the final check signed, the last measurement taken. For years, people had dismissed me at first glance, the old truck, the faded shirts, the modest home. And yet, with a single signature, I had watched attitudes flip like a coin tossed into the air. Respect, it seemed, could be purchased as easily as a suit. But for me, this wasn't about vanity. It was about preparation. Back home, I laid out everything I had acquired over the last 2 weeks. The custom suit, polished shoes, silk ties, the Rolex still ticking steadily on my wrist. I glanced out the window where the Phantom waited, Marcus standing by with the quiet discipline of a soldier. Piece by piece, the transformation was taking shape. But this was never about becoming someone new. It was about reminding them that I had never been the man they thought I was. At night, I sat in the living room with Mary's photograph propped beside me, the silence broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. "I wish you could see this, Mary," I whispered. "You'd tell me not to waste energy on revenge, to forgive and let go." I paused, my chest tightening. But this isn't just about me anymore. It's about teaching Loretta that family is not disposable. It's about making sure Victor never forgets the price of arrogance. The calendar on the wall marked the days with a steady rhythm. Each evening, I crossed another square in red ink, watching June 15th draw nearer. It wasn't dread I felt, it was anticipation, like a soldier waiting for the whistle before battle. Every phone call with James, every signed document, every receipt was another step toward something inevitable. Still, doubts crept in during the quiet hours. What if Loretta saw this as cruelty instead of justice? What if all she remembered was a father who embarrassed her on the most important day of her life? I wrestled with those thoughts until dawn on more than one occasion. But each time I returned to the same truth: she had already chosen to discard me. I had nothing left to lose, and everything to prove. On June 12th, I slipped into the finished suit for the first time. The fabric hugged my shoulders perfectly, the charcoal gray shimmering under soft light. Marcus, waiting in the foyer, gave a low whistle despite his usual stoicism. "Sir, you look like a man who owns the world." I smiled faintly. No, Marcus. Just a man who remembers what it feels like to be underestimated. That night, I rehearsed my speech in front of the mirror. The words were etched into my memory, but I wanted them to land with precision, calm, unshakable, devastating. 17 million, 10 million revoked, all redirected to children who would never be called beggars again. I pictured Victor's face paling, Loretta's glass slipping from her hand, the room erupting in whispers. By the time I lay down to sleep, I felt the weight of months of humiliation melt into resolve. The stage was nearly set. They had laughed at the beggar. Soon they would bow before the man who had written his own definition of worth. Yesterday I was a beggar. Today she needed $30,000. The irony was almost laughable, but there was nothing funny about the voice I heard on the other end of the phone that morning. Loretta's tone was sweet, too sweet, like honey poured over something rotten. "Good morning, Daddy," she began, her words dripping with artificial warmth. I hadn't heard her call me that in months, not since she'd let Victor humiliate me in that restaurant. I kept my own voice steady. "What do you need, Loretta?" There was a pause, just long enough for her to collect herself. "Well, Victor and I have run into a little financial snag. The florist is asking for payment up front, and the decorator insists on a deposit by Friday. Nothing huge, just 30,000. She said it as though she were asking for loose change, as though $30,000 were no more significant than a tip left on a cafe table. For a moment, I didn't answer. I thought of the night she sat across from me, unable to meet my eyes as Victor called me a beggar. I thought of the way she laughed nervously when he said I didn't belong, And now, barely 3 weeks later, she was calling me for help. That's interesting, I said. Finally, my tone calm but edged. Yesterday, I was too poor to attend your wedding. Today, you want $30,000. Her voice sharpened immediately, the syrup vanishing. This is different, Daddy. This isn't about appearances. It's about the wedding itself. Everyone else's parents are contributing. You should want to help make my day perfect. I let the silence stretch until she grew uncomfortable. Loretta, I said at last. Victor claims to move in elite circles. Surely one of his wealthy business friends can cover the costs. There was a hitch in her breathing, just enough to betray her frustration. Why are you being so difficult about this? You don't even need the money. You live in that little house with nothing to spend it on. I'm your daughter. Isn't it your job to support me? Her words hit harder than she intended. In her mind, I was still the man in the old jacket, the one who should be grateful just to have a place near her world. She had no idea about the suit hanging in my closet, the phantom waiting in my driveway, or the speech I was preparing. No, I said simply. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. No, she repeated as though the word were foreign. I mean, no, I said again, steady and unshaken. Ask Victor, ask his associates. I'm sure they'll be delighted to assist. Her composure cracked. The warmth vanished, entirely replaced by a cold edge. Fine. Don't help. But don't expect a relationship with me after this. Victor says we don't need people in our lives who won't support our happiness. I listened for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. Then I said quietly, "Goodbye, Loretta." And I hung up. The phone clicked silent, but the echo of her entitlement lingered. Yesterday I was an embarrassment. Today I was her solution. Tomorrow she would learn what those choices had cost her. I'm your daughter. The words rang through the receiver like a command rather than a plea. Loretta's voice had lost any trace of sweetness, now sharpened into something entitled, brittle, almost desperate. You're supposed to help me. That's what fathers do. I sat at the kitchen table, the morning sunlight spilling across the wood. My chipped coffee mug rested in my hand, the steam curling upward, steady and calm. For once, I didn't let her tone shake me. Loretta, I said, my voice measured. What fathers do is raise their children, feed them, clothe them, sacrifice so they can grow into adults who know the value of love and family. That part I did. 30 years worth. What you're asking now has nothing to do with being a father. It has everything to do with money. She scoffed, sharp and bitter. Don't make this about values, Daddy. It's just money. You don't even spend it on yourself. You drive that rusted old truck, wear the same clothes for years. What good is money if you just let it sit there while your daughter struggles? Her words might have once stung, but now they revealed more than she realized. She thought I was hoarding pennies in a jar, scraping by, clinging to scraps. She had no idea of the $17 million hidden in plain sight. She saw me as nothing more than a resource to be tapped when convenient and dismissed when not. I let a silence hang before answering. Loretta, do you remember the Christmas I built you that dollhouse in the garage? How you hugged me like I'd given you the world. She hesitated, caught off guard. What does that have to do with anything? It has everything to do with it, I replied. Back then, it wasn't about the price tag. It was about love. But now you're telling me that unless I write a check, I'm not a father. If that's true, then maybe you've forgotten what really matters. Her voice snapped back, cold and defensive. Don't twist this. I just want a wedding that reflects the life Victor and I are building. Everyone else's families contribute. Why can't you do the same? I stared at Mary's photograph across the room, her smile frozen in timeless kindness. Because Loretta, I said softly, yesterday you agreed I was too poor to sit at your wedding. And today you tell me I'm failing as a father unless I pay for it. You can't have it both ways. Her frustration boiled over. You're unbelievable. Do you want me to be humiliated in front of Victor's friends? Do you want people to think we can't afford our own wedding? You'll ruin everything. I sipped my coffee, steady and unshaken. If appearances matter more than family, Loretta, then that's already ruined. There was a long pause, then the line went dead. She had hung up on me. I sat in the silence, staring at the phone. Once her words could have broken me, but now they only steeled me further. Victor had taught her to measure worth by appearances. Soon I would use appearances to destroy his illusions and hers. Then don't expect a relationship with me. The words didn't just sting, they cut with the precision of a blade, honed by years of entitlement. Loretta's voice was colder now, stripped of the pretense of daughterly affection. If you can't support me in this, then I don't need you in my life. I sat in my living room, the phone pressed against my ear, but my eyes fixed on the mantel where Mary's picture smiled back at me. My late wife's eyes seemed to ask the question I was already asking myself. Is this really our daughter speaking? My grip on the phone tightened. A part of me wanted to argue, to plead with Loretta to remember who I was, to remind her of the countless sacrifices that had paved the road to her success. But another part of me, the part that had endured Victor's sneer that had been cut down in that restaurant, knew better. Pleading would only feed her illusion of superiority. Loretta, I said evenly, do you understand what you're saying? That the bond between us, 30 years of love and sacrifice, is worth less than a wedding deposit? Her reply was immediate, harsh. Don't guilt me, Daddy. You had your chance to be part of this family, and you embarrassed me instead. Victor's right, you live in the past. You don't understand what it takes to be part of his world. Victor's world. The phrase sank like a stone in my gut. This wasn't just Loretta lashing out, it was his voice echoing through hers, poisoning her thoughts, reshaping her values. Your mother and I raised you to believe family comes before everything else, I said quietly. If you truly believe Victor's world is more important than mine, then maybe you've already made your choice. Her tone softened only slightly, but it was laced with calculation. Victor says we don't need people who drag us down. If you can't support us, we'll move forward without you. I closed my eyes. The hurt was real, pressing like a weight against my chest, but beneath it was a strange calm. She thought she was delivering an ultimatum that would break me. Instead, she was cementing my resolve. I understand, I said, my voice steady. And I want you to remember these words, Loretta. Because one day, when the world you've chosen starts to crack, you'll realize what it cost you. There was silence on the line, then the sharp click of disconnection. She had hung up again, severing the line as though severing the bond itself. I set the phone down gently, staring at it, as if it might spring back to life with her laughter, her voice, the child she once was. But the silence remained heavy and unyielding. I walked to the window, looking out at the driveway where the phantom gleamed under the morning sun. My reflection in the glass looked different, harder, more deliberate. Loretta thought she had the power to cut me out of her life. What she didn't realize was that I was already preparing to cut her illusions to pieces. Victor had turned my daughter against me, but he had also handed me the perfect weapon, their obsession with appearances. They wanted to live in his world of shallow wealth. Very well. I would make sure the entire world saw how fragile that world really was. Victor says you're irrelevant. Loretta's voice was clipped, almost businesslike, as if she were reading a memo instead of speaking to her own father. The words settled over me like frost, chilling, but no longer surprising. By now, I recognized the pattern. Her thoughts weren't her own. They were echoes of his rehearsed lines designed to wound. I leaned back in my chair, the phone pressed to my ear, my eyes fixed on the photograph of Mary. My late wife's calm smile reminded me that once Loretta had been different. Once she had defended me against cruel kids who mocked our old car. Once she had sat proudly beside me at her graduation. But now she sounded more like Victor's apprentice than my daughter. "Is that so?" I said, keeping my tone even. "Yes," she replied, her confidence growing. "He says you don't understand what success looks like. You'll never fit into our lives, Daddy. We're moving forward with or without you." Her words struck like stones, but instead of shattering me, they built a wall of clarity. I finally saw it. Victor wasn't satisfied with excluding me from the wedding. He wanted to erase me completely, to sever Loretta from her past and remake her in his image. And Loretta, blinded by wealth and flattery, was letting him. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to stay calm. Loretta listened carefully. Victor's world is built on sand. It may look strong now, but when the tide comes in, it will crumble. And when it does, I don't want you to realize too late what you've traded away. Her laughter was brittle, rehearsed. "You sound bitter, Daddy. You should be happy for me, not jealous of him." Jealous? The word stung, but in a way that almost made me laugh. What did I have to be jealous of a man who measured himself by the brand of his suit, who sneered at waiters and mocked fathers? If anything, I pitied him. And I pitied Loretta more for believing his approval was worth more than her own blood. "Loretta," I said quietly, "I raised you after your mother died. I carried this family when we had nothing but each other. If you can forget that so easily, then maybe you've already made your choice. But don't confuse my silence for weakness. You'll see soon enough what I mean." There was silence on the line, a pause that told me she had heard the steel in my voice. Then, without another word, she hung up. I set the phone down and stood pacing the living room. My anger no longer burned hot. It had cooled into something sharper, something far more dangerous. Victor thought he had won, that he had stripped me of influence. But all he had really done was awaken a part of me I hadn't needed in years. The part that knew how to plan, how to wait, how to strike when the moment was right. I turned to the calendar, my eyes fixed on June 15th. That red circle was no longer just a date. It was a deadline. And when the hour arrived, neither Victor nor Loretta would ever forget the lesson I was about to teach. June 15th, marked in red. I drew the circle with slow, deliberate strokes on the wall calendar that hung in my kitchen. The ink bled slightly into the paper, but that only made it stand out more, a deadline, a reckoning, a moment no one would forget. For weeks I had carried the weight of humiliation like a stone in my chest. But as I stood there staring at that circle, I realized the stone had hardened into something else: resolve. I stepped back and studied the dates leading up to it. Each square had already been crossed out in steady pen strokes, days lived with quiet planning nights, spent in silence rehearsing what was to come. The calendar wasn't just a measure of time anymore. It was a countdown to justice. On the mantel, Mary's photograph caught the early light. I picked it up, tracing the edges of the frame with my thumb. "You always told me not to fight fire with fire," I whispered. "But what they've done isn't just disrespect, it's betrayal. And sometimes betrayal requires more than forgiveness. It requires a lesson." I placed the photograph back, then walked to the window. Outside, the Phantom sat in the driveway, its midnight blue paint gleaming even in the morning haze. Marcus stood nearby, running a cloth over the hood with military precision. He noticed me watching and gave a respectful nod. That car, that driver, that image, they were all tools. Now weapons forged from the very currency Victor worshipped. In the evenings, I found myself rehearsing again, pacing the living room with note cards in hand. My speech was no longer a blessing. It had become a blade carefully honed, ready to slice through the illusions Victor and Loretta had built. 17 million. 10 million revoked. Redirected to children who would never again be mocked for their humble beginnings. The words rolled off my tongue like scripture, each syllable sharper than the last. Still doubt crept in at odd moments. I'd sit at the kitchen table, the house quiet except for the ticking clock, and wonder if I was about to destroy the last fragile thread between me and Loretta. Was I punishing her or saving her from herself? The line blurred in my mind. But then I remembered her voice, cold, dismissive, repeating Victor's words like a mantra. Victor says you're irrelevant. That was the moment I stopped doubting. Irrelevant. They would learn what irrelevance truly meant when the wealth they dismissed as non-existent became the spotlight that revealed their arrogance to the world. On June 14th, I laid everything out one final time. The tailored suit pressed to perfection, the Rolex gleaming, the polished shoes waiting by the door. The note cards sat neatly stacked on my desk, though by then I hardly needed them. Every word was burned into me. As I crossed off the last square before the red circle, I felt no fear, no hesitation, only purpose. The beggar they had mocked was gone. On June 15th, they would meet a man who had turned humiliation into a lesson worth $17 million. The phantom's door opened and silence fell. That's how I'll always remember it, the moment a single car brought 200 voices to a halt. The Rolls-Royce glided up the circular drive of the grand Greenwich estate, like a ship of war arriving in a quiet harbor. Its midnight blue exterior shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, polished so brightly it reflected the marble fountains and manicured gardens that lined the approach. Marcus, immaculate in his chauffeur's uniform, stepped smartly from the driver's seat and moved to open the rear door. I felt the weight of every gaze before I even set foot on the stone drive. Guests in their designer suits and glittering gowns stopped mid-conversation. Champagne glasses hovered in mid-air. All eyes turned toward the car that did not belong to Victor's fleet of flashy toys, but dwarfed them nonetheless. As I stepped out, my Italian leather shoes clicked against the stone, steady and deliberate. The Brooks Brothers suit hugged my frame. The Rolex glinted in the sunlight. I carried myself with calm authority, each step a statement. The whispers began instantly spreading like ripples on a pond. "Who is that?" someone hissed. "Look at that phantom. $500,000 at least. Isn't that?" Loretta's father. I caught sight of Loretta near the garden entrance, greeting guests with the polished smile Victor demanded. The champagne flute in her hand froze mid-air as she saw me. Her face flickered from confusion to recognition to shock in a span of seconds. She grabbed Victor's arm and whispered frantically. His head snapped up, and for the first time since I met him, I saw his smug smile falter. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, nodding as if I belonged among them, because I did. Every step toward the reception area was measured, deliberate. 200 guests parted subtly to make space drawn by curiosity and a need to be near the unfolding drama. Victor moved quickly, dragging Loretta behind him. His voice cracked as he reached me. "Mr. Watkins, we must have forgotten to send you an invitation. What a wonderful surprise." I lifted the glass, taking a slow sip. "How considerate of you to remember me now," I said smoothly. My voice carried just enough to ensure the nearest clusters of guests heard every word. It truly is a lovely venue. You have excellent taste. Whispers buzzed louder, a chorus of fascination. Guests who had dismissed me weeks ago as an absent figure now leaned forward, phones discreetly raised, eager to capture the mystery of the man who had arrived in a phantom and wore money like a second skin. Victor's composure cracked further, though he tried to mask it with forced cheer. Loretta's face was pale, her smile tight and trembling. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small in her world. I felt like the ground she was standing on had shifted. The beggar had arrived not in rags, but in a Rolls-Royce. And every pair of eyes in that garden now saw who truly commanded respect. Dear guests, some called me a beggar. The words rolled off my tongue with deliberate calm, yet they hit the ballroom like thunder. 200 guests sat frozen at round tables adorned with roses and gold trim, their polished silverware suspended mid-air as they turned their attention to me. The chandeliers above glimmered like constellations, casting light on a moment none of them had expected when they took their seats for dinner. I stood at the microphone, my glass in hand, my suit fitting like armor. Loretta sat at the bridal table, her champagne glass trembling visibly, while Victor leaned back in his chair, his forced smile stretched too thin. He wanted me silent, invisible, erased. Instead, I was commanding the room. I paused, letting the silence deepen, allowing every guest to lean in. Some of you may not know me well. I'm Leland Watkins, father of the bride. And yes, recently I was told in no uncertain terms that I had no place at this wedding, that my presence was unworthy. My eyes flicked toward Victor, who flushed crimson under the gaze of his own peers. The crowd shifted, whispers rippling like a current. Phones were lifted subtly, cameras already recording. They sensed history unfolding, an old man reclaiming his dignity in the most public way possible. I won't bore you with all the details, I continued, my tone steady, measured. But I will share a truth. Appearances deceive. Suits, cars, houses, they are illusions people use to measure worth. And illusions are fragile. The murmurs grew louder. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled free a set of neatly folded documents. The rustle of paper echoed in the silence, amplifying the suspense. I held them up so the guests at the front could glimpse the brokerage letterhead, the official seals. These are my investment statements, I said, my voice cutting clear as glass. Apple, Tesla. Years of quiet decisions mocked as foolish. Their current value, $17 million. Gasps erupted across the room. Guests turned to one another, mouths open, repeating the figure as though saying it aloud might make it less impossible. Victor's jaw dropped, his carefully cultivated composure crumbling in front of his peers. Loretta's eyes widened in horror, her face pale as marble. I let the documents rest on the podium, the truth plain for all to see. 17 million, I repeated softly, letting the number linger. So when I was called a beggar, perhaps the real beggar was not who they thought. The ballroom erupted again, half in shock, half in fascination. Guests shifted in their seats, phones raised openly, now eager to capture Victor's humiliation. Loretta's hand shook so violently, her champagne glass slipped crashing to the floor in shards that glittered under the chandelier's glow. I waited for the noise to settle, then leaned closer to the microphone. Tonight was meant to be a celebration of love, of unity, of family. Instead, it became a lesson in arrogance. And before this evening is done, I intend to finish that lesson. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Every eye was on me. Every ear strained for what I would say next. And Victor, for the first time since I met him, looked like a man who wished he had never underestimated me. 17 million, I repeated, letting the number hang in the air like a verdict. The room buzzed guests whispering furiously, cameras lifted higher, capturing every flicker of emotion across Victor's and Loretta's faces. Their carefully constructed image was cracking before 200 witnesses, and I hadn't even delivered the final blow. I set the portfolio down on the podium, then reached into my jacket again, producing another folder. My hand lingered on it for a moment, the weight of years pressing down on me. Originally, I said, my voice steady, I had prepared a different kind of wedding gift. A father's gift. Something I believed would secure my daughter's future long after I was gone. The room leaned in. Loretta sat straighter, her eyes glistening with desperate hope. She had no idea what was coming, and for a fleeting second, I almost pitied her. This, I continued lifting the folder, is the draft of a trust fund. $10 million set aside specifically for Loretta. It was structured to provide her security and stability, while encouraging generosity through education and charitable giving. The gasp that rippled through the crowd was audible as though the very air had been sucked from the room. 10 million. Even Victor flinched, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Loretta's lips parted, her face pale, trembling with realization. I let the silence stretch before I spoke again, my tone colder now. But that trust will never be enacted. It was written months ago, before I was told I was too poor to stand at my own daughter's wedding. Before I was humiliated for wearing khakis instead of Armani. Before my love was dismissed as worthless because it didn't come wrapped in a price tag. The words fell heavy, each one striking like a hammer. Loretta shook her head faintly, as though denying what she already knew. "Dad, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't flinch. You had your chance, Loretta. Family stands together. Your mother taught you that. But you chose Victor's world over mine. You chose appearances over love. So tonight I'm choosing too. I unfolded the last page of the folder, holding it high so the front row could see the bold lettering of legal signatures. Every dollar of my $17 million is already committed to educational charities. Scholarships for children from modest homes. Children who might one day be called beggars by people who can't see past appearances. That money will change their lives because they deserve a chance, not because they bowed to arrogance. The ballroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, even applause broke out in pockets of the room. Guests turned to stare openly at Victor and Loretta, their faces etched with judgment. Phones recorded furiously, eager to share the downfall of a couple who had mocked their own father. Loretta's champagne glass slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering at her feet. Victor shot to his feet, his voice rising in panic. "You insane old man, you've ruined everything," but his protest was drowned in the sea of murmurs and disapproval surrounding him. I stepped back from the microphone, calm, unshaken. The beggar they dismissed had become the man who had stripped their illusions bare, and the lesson had only just landed. This $10 million trust was meant for her. I repeated, my voice echoing through the hushed ballroom. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the clink of crystal glasses as someone set theirs down a little too hard. 200 guests watched as my daughter's world unraveled before their eyes. Loretta stumbled from her chair, her gown rustling as she made her way toward me. Her face was streaked with tears, mascara bleeding in dark trails down her cheeks. "Dad, please," she whispered, her voice cracked and desperate. I didn't mean it. I was wrong. "We can talk about this, can't we? We can fix it." The sight should have broken me once it would have. But the memory of her nodding in agreement while Victor called me a beggar rose like a wall between us. "Some choices," I said quietly, "cannot be undone." She reached the podium, trembling hands, clutching at the edge. "You don't understand," she pleaded, her words tumbling over each other. "Victor, He just gets carried away sometimes. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was embarrassed. Yes, but I still love you. Please, Daddy, don't do this. Behind her, Victor was unraveling. His face was flushed, his voice cracking as he shouted at anyone who would listen. This is ridiculous. He's not serious. It's a stunt. None of this means anything, but the guests weren't listening to him. Their gazes were fixed on me and the truth of those signed documents in my hand. I leaned closer to the microphone, my eyes locked on Loretta's. You chose Loretta. You chose silence when I was insulted. You chose his voice over mine, his world over the family that raised you. And now you want to erase that choice with tears. Her sobs grew louder, filling the space between us. Please, she begged, don't turn your back on me. Don't make me lose everything. I straightened my voice, calm but unyielding. You lost what mattered the moment you believed money made you better than family. Tonight, I'm not turning my back. I'm showing you the cost of the path you chose. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but I held firm. The documents lay open on the podium, the signatures bold and final. Around us, the atmosphere shifted, no longer a wedding celebration, but a courtroom where judgment had been delivered. Victor stormed forward, his voice shrill. This is insanity. He's destroying his own daughter's life out of spite. But the disdain in the guest's eyes wasn't directed at me. It was aimed squarely at him. I turned back to Loretta, who stood trembling at the podium, her tears falling freely. You called me irrelevant, I said, my voice low but steady. But tonight I've shown you what irrelevance looks like. It's the moment when your arrogance leaves you with nothing but regret. Her knees buckled, and she sank into a chair, her sobs muffled by the rustle of silk. I folded the documents, tucked them back into my jacket, and stepped away from the microphone. The room remained utterly silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on every guest. They all knew what they had just witnessed wasn't vengeance alone. It was a father teaching his daughter and her groom the harshest lesson of their lives. Some choices can't be undone. I let those words linger one last time before stepping back from the microphone. A hush fell over the ballroom, heavy and absolute. Even the string quartet in the corner sat frozen bows, poised mid-air, as though unwilling to break the spell of silence that had descended. 200 guests watched as I folded the documents and slipped them into my jacket pocket, sealing the verdict that could never be reversed. Loretta's sobs filled the space I left behind. She reached after me, her fingers trembling, mascara streaks cutting across her pale cheeks. Dad, wait, please, don't go. We can fix this. I'll make it right, I promise. But the promises were too late. I turned just enough to meet her gaze, the same eyes that once sparkled when she opened a handmade dollhouse on Christmas morning. Now they were wide with desperation, hollowed by the sudden knowledge of all she had thrown away. Daughter, I said quietly, so only she and the nearest guests could hear, I loved you enough to give you everything, and you chose to trade it for nothing. Now you'll live with that choice. Behind her, Victor was unraveling in spectacular fashion. His face burned crimson as he raged at anyone who would listen. This is a farce, he's lying. Nobody throws away $17 million. He's bluffing, but his voice was drowned by the buzz of disgusted whispers, the guests recoiling as though his arrogance were contagious. An older gentleman muttered just loud enough to be heard, 17 million, and the fool threw it away by calling him a beggar. His wife shook her head. What a waste. The judgment of Victor's peers struck harder than anything I could have said. He looked around desperately for support, but saw only a wall of disdain. The empire of image he had built was crumbling in real time, and the more he shouted, the faster it collapsed. I walked slowly down the center aisle of the ballroom, the guests parting as though I carried an invisible authority. Their phones were raised, capturing my exit, ensuring that this story would not end in whispers, but in headlines, in shared videos, in reputations remade overnight. My steps were steady, each one carrying not bitterness, but a sense of finality. The ballroom doors opened onto the grand foyer where Marcus waited beside the Phantom. Impeccable as always, he bowed slightly as he opened the rear door. "I trust everything went as planned, sir, better than I could have hoped," I replied, sliding into the cream leather interior. As the Phantom purred to life, I caught one last glimpse through the tinted window. Loretta stood on the marble steps, her $1,000 gown crumpled, as she sank against the railing, sobbing into her hands. Victor paced nearby, surrounded by guests, whispering with the unmistakable air of disdain. The lesson had been delivered, sharp and irrevocable. The car rolled smoothly down the tree-lined driveway, away from the shattered illusion of a wedding, and into the quiet of the Connecticut evening. For the first time in months, I felt lighter. Justice hadn't come in anger or shouting, but in dignity and truth, in a lesson that would echo far beyond that ballroom. The beggar they mocked had walked away, not broken, but triumphant. Wealth, I've learned, has very little to do with money. True wealth is measured in dignity, in self-respect, and in the legacy you leave behind. That night, walking out of the wedding, I didn't feel like a man who had lost a daughter. I felt like a father who had finally shown her the cost of betrayal. Loretta and Victor wanted to build a life on appearances, but appearances crumble when the truth is revealed. And the truth was simple: love, loyalty, and family cannot be bought or bartered. It wasn't easy. No parent dreams of teaching their child a lesson in front of 200 strangers. But sometimes lessons only take root when they cut deep. By redirecting every dollar to children who needed it most, I found peace. Maybe Loretta will one day understand that her greatest inheritance wasn't money. It was the chance to learn humility before it was too late. For those of you listening, I want to leave you with this. Don't let anyone measure your worth by the clothes you wear, the car you drive, or the balance in your bank account. Your worth comes from the love you give, the sacrifices you make, and the dignity you hold on to even when the world tries to strip it away. Have you ever faced a betrayal like mine? How did you handle it, and what did you learn? Share your story in the comments. If this story meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for listening.